So thank you very much. And I want to say thank you for joining this webinar. And we're going to be talking about, did I write that? And with a focus on editing and revising, mainly geared towards more advanced students, so probably intermediate and beyond. Those of you who are teaching a lower level or lower proficiency students, you can probably see some ideas in here that you'll be able to adapt. But I also thought that the title had two meanings, like, did I write that? When you read something, I know I've had that feeling when I read something, I can't believe I wrote that, in the sense that there are some errors. But also it can be a sense of pride of, did I write that? Wow. So here are my presentation goals. I'd like to talk about the goals of academic writing, because I think sometimes we forget to think about how those can be so different from the types of writing we often engage in daily life. I want to just briefly remind us about the writing process and all that's involved. And then I'll spend the majority of my time looking at editing and revising, and hopefully, it's my goal at least, to give you some useful ideas and resources that you can take into your classrooms. So when we think about academic writing, I'm sure that all of us have thought about why academic writing is so hard. And so I want us to think about these things. So the goal is to convey information. And that's an important goal. It's a goal that sometimes we convey a lot of personal information in our blogs, or people have tweets and all sorts of things that are basically conveying more personal and interactional information. But in academic writing, we want to convey information that is not personal. It's more, I guess you could call it, informative information. And we accomplish academic writing through different types of writing tasks. I want you to take just a second, think about some of the writing tasks either that you've done in the past week or so, or that you've asked your students to do. So here are some of the sort of typical tasks that I've thought about and that I've participated in the last week or so. And one is narratives. And I think this is something, as writing teachers, we often start out, especially at lower levels, writing narratives because our students know about themselves. But one of the things that happens in academic writing is that narratives shift from that kind of interpersonal focus to a more informational focus. And some disciplines that have strong narrative tasks are history and social sciences, social studies. So I think it's important for us as teachers to also incorporate narratives, but with an informational focus. Argumentative and persuasive tasks, probably we all do that. That's one of the most frequent types of writing that our students will tackle, and we know that from writing research. Numerous studies have looked at the types of writing that students do. And then students also often are asked to do summary writing, or a summary and then respond to something. Perhaps have read an article that takes a particular position. They write a summary of that, and then they have to write a response and, sort of their opinion. And then also critique and evaluation. And I imagine that as teachers, most of us have our students that do these particular tasks. There are also some discipline-specific tasks. I think that it's important for us when we teach writing, not only to teach our students how to write in these particular tasks or registers or genres, but also to prepare them so that they can look at writing and be able to figure out how a task is constructed. Because if your classes are like mine, we have students from many different majors when we're teaching an ESL class or an EFL class. And we might have biologists in there. We might have students who are going to major in business. We might have some students who hope to go into some legal aspect of training, either as lawyers or as administrators in the government. So they will have to write things like lab reports if they're in the sciences. And if they're in business or law, they're going to have to write case studies. And we may not be familiar with those particular types of writing. But if we've taught our students how to look at academic writing and identify patterns, we can then help our students to be able to tackle these new types of writing that they will encounter, help them find models and sort of dissect those models. And another goal of academic writing is to have clear, accurate writing. And this is hard. And that's why I really wanted to focus on this aspect of editing and revising, because that's how we're going to get to clear, accurate writing. So the writing process. I imagine that all of you are familiar with the writing process. And there years ago was a lot of debate about process versus product and process versus product and which one's more important. And I think they're both equally important. I mean, a process without a product really doesn't accomplish much. And it's really hard to get to a final product without going through some sort of process. So we're going to just sort of remind ourselves about the process that we go through. So brainstorming, pretty easy at some level, but also really, really important. And also a time that we often have our students brainstorm by themselves. And I think it's important for us to include brainstorming also as a group or a peer activity where people can discuss ideas, but not have judgment. So any idea is a safe idea. And I think that's really, really important. Then we go through this process of first draft, second draft, third draft, however many drafts we ask our students to do. And we edit with each of these, so maybe sometimes we're having self-editing tasks, sometimes we're having peer editing tasks, maybe we're having teacher or group editing tasks. And this is really an important part of the writing process. It's also a part that helps us get to the final draft. But in doing all this, we really can create a situation where we have paper or digital overload. My goal today is to help us sort of tame that beast. And so we're going to really focus on drafting, editing, and revising, and try to avoid feeling like this little guy where we want to just snap our pencil and say, I can't handle all this work. So I hope that by the end of this session, you'll say, oh, I have some ideas I can use. So as we go through this drafting, editing, and revising process, we need to make our tasks manageable, not only for ourselves, but also for our students. I think it's really important, at least I think it's really important to reflect on how hard the task of writing is. First of all, it's not a natural act. None of us are born writing. We're born speaking, but we're not born writing. And it's something that we acquire. And as we go through school and as we encounter different types of tasks, we're constantly learning. We're really working on how to deal with this difficult task. And I think it's something that sometimes we forget. We assign a paper and think, oh yeah, they can go do that. We've taught them what they need. But I think it's still a pretty big task, and it's also kind of scary once you put stuff down on the paper and you have to share it. It can be scary. So we really need to create an environment where our drafting and editing and our feedback is something that's supportive and not something that is debilitating. So how can we make some of these tasks manageable for not only us, but also for our students? One way is to set realistic goals for each aspect. And I think we need to teach, and that's important, teach our students how to do self-editing and also teach our classes, our students, how to do peer editing, and also to help students learn the value of peer editing. And I think that this is something that every writing teacher faces when they first start having students do peer editing. Many times the students will say, well, I don't want him to read my paper, or I don't want her to read my paper. She's in my class. I want you, teacher, you have to read my paper. I want your feedback. And I think it's important for us to help students understand how peer editing can be a support and a tremendous resource for them, and something that they should be seeking as they go through writing their drafts. And I also am a big believer in checklists, and we'll be looking at some of those. So our first task is to set realistic goals. And I really, really hope that none of you ever received a paper like this. Even more than that, I hope you've never given a paper back to a student with this much feedback, because this is not realistic. I think any of us who would get a paper with this much feedback on it would shut down. Just say, oops, I can't write. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. So I think it's really important that we give feedback in a way that is manageable and also helps us manage the tasks. So too much feedback is not helpful. I think it's really important for us to have realistic expectations for drafts. So as we have a draft and we move through the cycle of writing or drafting and then rewriting a second draft or a third draft, we have a different focus for each draft. And we have to have realistic expectations for each of those drafts. And I know many times the first draft, the focus is just getting the main ideas down. Sometimes we usually take one of two approaches. We just want to make sure we can read it and understand it, and that the sentences are clear, and that there's really something to say. Remember, one of the first goals of academic writing that we discussed earlier was the fact that we want writing to convey information. So we want to have these different foci for each draft and have realistic expectations for each of those drafts. So let's look at teaching self and peer editing a little bit. So as I mentioned, guiding questions or checklists at each stage, and I'm going to be showing you two different types of checklists. But I think also as we ask students to even write their first draft, it might be useful to give them some questions like, what is your main idea? What are your supporting details? And just ask those questions and have students answer them in writing. And then as they're writing, that'll help them. That'll serve as an anchor. And this, collecting the first draft, that sounds like a no-brainer, right? Of course, we're going to collect the first draft. But this is a tip that I got from my friend and colleague, Jean Lambert. She does this. She collects the first draft, and then she returns it to the students to read through. And when I first heard this, I thought that's such a clever idea, because as we know, our students are often writing that first draft right up to the deadline. So this idea of having time to let your writing sit for a little bit and then go back and reread it often doesn't happen with the first draft, or even sometimes even the final draft. And so this idea of not that us as teachers don't spend hours on each of the first drafts, this was really clever to give it back to the student, and then they've had that buffer zone of time, and then they go back and in a sense resubmit their first draft, and maybe you want to call it a second draft at that point, and that's fine. But I thought this was a really clever idea. So thank you, Jean Lambert. Here's an example of what I think is a useful self checklist. And I think that it can be helpful for students to just see something this basic of, did you answer the prompt if they were given a prompt, or did you accomplish the task? And then this checklist is focusing on a compare and contrast assignment. You, of course, can modify this for any assignment, any writing assignment that you give students, but it takes students step by step, and they have this right-hand column where they can write yes, no, they could write, I am not really sure. But it gives them a way to go back and look at their paper, look at their draft, and see if they have used examples to strengthen arguments. Did they use transitions? And do they summarize main points in their concluding paragraph? And notice it doesn't specify how many paragraphs. It's just, did you do these tasks? So I think this is at least for my way of thinking, it's a nice self-checklist. I know that when I write academic papers, I have a checklist that I look at. Is my title clear? Does my introductory section or introductory paragraph, if it's a short article, does it actually set the reader up for what I'm going to do and why I'm going to do it? I think that even very experienced writers benefit from the use of a checklist, because it's easy to start writing and then sort of drift away on different tangents, and checklists can help to constrain us. So I hope that you see how this could be useful as a self-checklist for the writer, the student writer. And then I'm going to give you one example of a peer checklist, but obviously this can get adapted in many, many different ways. And so and you'll notice as you look at this, which of your partner's ideas seem strongest? Which of your partner's ideas need to be explained more clearly? What could your partner add or remove to make the essay stronger and easier to understand? Now, this is sort of a generic list in the sense that it's not specific to a particular writing assignment or writing tasks. You could use this whether students are writing a lab report or whether they're writing an argumentative essay or a compare and contrast, whatever type of writing they're doing. This checklist is somewhat generic. So it's nice because it can get recycled. It can also be done in such a way where the students they'll write notes, but they have to write something. Which of your partner's ideas seem strongest to you? They have to write down which ideas are strongest. And that's important feedback, because as we're writing, often we're not sure of the background knowledge of our readers. And this is a way for us to be able to get that information. Maybe the idea that I thought as a writer was the most strongest really isn't to my reader. So this is useful. And the idea of using a similar checklist across different tasks is also nice, because then the peer who is using this checklist isn't starting from scratch every time. They're familiar with it. And they might have different ways of being able to indicate, which of your ideas need to be explained more clearly. They can actually say, I made marks on your paper, so they can reference it. They don't have to write down everything in this note space. Another thing that I think we as teachers know, we know mistakes that our students are going to make. We can anticipate many of those mistakes, no matter what level someone's writing at. We can anticipate. So here is an example of some common mistakes that people make when they're writing compare and contrast essays. These are some grammar mistakes that are made, or typical omissions that are made. And so by giving these to students and saying, hey, watch out for these, can be useful also. And so you can include that as a secondary checklist. And notice there's only 4 of them here. We never want to give a checklist of more than, maybe 4 to 6 items when it comes to this sort of thing to go through and check for. But then taking this list of common mistakes and giving our students practice with editing can be really useful. So here's an example of an editing task that students can do. They're not reading their own papers. They're not reading their peers' papers. This is a paper that has been created by the teacher, or in this case, out of a grammar book. But this allows students to get practice reading to find mistakes. So reading carefully, not reading to get content, well, getting content hopefully, but then also finding mistakes. And in this case, we've told them there are 12 more mistakes in this student's essay. And those 12 mistakes are directly related to these 4 that we were focusing on. So one of the things that we see here is that this type of practice is really important. Because I know from my own writing and reading my own writing and trying to get it clear and accurate, we often have looked at it so much that we don't see the errors that we're making. So this is a really nice task that helps students learn how to read with an editing eye. And I know from personal experience that this type of task transfers nicely to helping students be able to read their own writing in a more careful manner. I think it's also important for us to vary the feedback mode. So we can do writing conferences where there's student to student or student to teacher. Those are really nice. We have a paper in front of us. We have some things. I think it's really important in order for a writing conference to be effective that it's not the first time. So let's say that we have a student to student doing a writing conference. They've already exchanged papers. They've had time to read the paper. They're not sitting down at a table and seeing that paper for the first time. The same thing when it's a student to teacher conference. I think questions as feedback is really useful. Is this a supporting detail? Can you underline your main idea? So that's a way, not necessarily at a writing conference to give feedback, you could use that, but also as you're reading maybe a first or second draft, this can be a really nice way to help students interact with the text and to, in a sense, get their own feedback. Audio feedback is something that can be useful. People have used this when reading a draft and they make, and it's so easy now since almost everybody has a phone that also does amazing recordings. They can, just say number 1 and record a sound bite for that. And then I also think it's really nice to use what I call discovery feedback. And that's using colors. And I'm going to show you an example of this. I'm going to show you first an example of the tool that I use to do this, and then I'll show you a more detailed example. So, your discovery feedback, I use an online resource that probably many of you, or some, well, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, and it is a website called Word and Phrase. And it's a corpus. It's a site that's built based on the academic portion of the COCA, the Corpus of Contemporary American English. And this has only academic or informationally focused articles in it. So I think if you haven't spent any time looking at this, it's worth it. And I hope that as I show you how I use it, you can get some ideas that might be useful for your students and also save you some time. So when you go to the website, this is what it looks like. You always see these boxes, and the box on the left is different. And if you do this as a class activity, you should let your students know that that frequency list will not be the same for each one of them, and they shouldn't panic. What this allows us to do is we can input and analyze text. So we can have students put texts in. And so when we click on the input and analyze text, we get a screen like this. And you'll see there's a little, on the left-hand side, just above the white space, there's a drop-down menu that says samples. So there are some example texts in there if you want to just use those. But I like to have my students, and when I demonstrate this, I put in my own texts in this box. So you just copy and paste. And here you see the text that was in, well, you see part of the text that was input right here. And you also see it over here on the left. And since my focus right now is on how words are used, I'm not going to bother explaining some of the stuff at the top, but there's a lot of online support for this. But by clicking on a particular word, and in this case, we're clicking on the word resources, see right down here, the different types of registers, the different types of situational contexts where this word is used. So we can see from this little bar graph that it's very common in academic writing, not so common in fiction. So that tells us something, that this is probably a more academic word. But what I really, really like about this site is the fact that it gives us collocates. And I don't know if any of you were able to hear the webinar that Larry Svire did earlier. Last week, he did one on collocations. And so this ties in nicely with that webinar. And this gives you a sense of adjectives that go with it commonly, that go commonly with the word resources, nouns that go with the word resources, and also verbs. And this can help us get a better sense of what that word resources means. That's something I think that we think of as very positive because we develop it, we protect it, we support it, we manage it, we share it. So this is a way that students can look at a word, get a better sense. But this is also how I use this site I'm going to show you how I use this site after I've demonstrated it like this to my students. When they turn in a paper and they have something that I feel that they could improve, but I don't want to be the one telling them how to improve it. Here's an example of a sentence that was written by one of my students, and it was in a review article, and it says she is a notorious scholar. So all I do is I highlight this word, the word that I am curious about, or that I think they could use a different word. I don't have to write any more notes because my students know that this is how I'm going to give feedback. And so that student knows when they see this highlighting, actually I use green highlighting, but it didn't work in this PowerPoint as well. So when they see that highlighting, they know to go website, word and phrase, and put the word notorious in. And then they can look down here and they see what's usually associated with the adjective notorious. We see words like murder, drugs, killer, terrorist, criminal. Not a happy word, nice word, and not one that we would usually use to refer to a scholar in a positive manner. But you can easily see how someone who's a second language learner would see the word notorious as being good because it reflects notoriety. So this is a nice way that I like to think of as discovery feedback that engages the student in a meaningful way without me as the teacher having to say, no, you should use one of these words. So it helps them see the sense for that word, and then they can go on and look at some other words that might be more useful in that sense. Maybe looking up the word scholar and seeing adjectives that happen before the word scholar. It also provides the students with a resource that when they leave my classroom, they have a tool that they can use no matter what class they're in. So to wrap up, I hope that you have been reminded of some of the goals of academic writing. And in that reminding, that you also realize what a big task we're asking our students to do. We're really asking them to do something that's quite difficult and involves very sophisticated language use. And so the idea of embracing multiple drafts is something that I think is important, and also to help students realize that we create multiple drafts, even as people who have been doing academic writing for a long time. We've thought about the writing process and how we can make it a little bit more manageable for us, and also how we can help our students realize this isn't a process that you just do in an English class or in a composition class. This is a lifelong academic writing task. I know many times we wish it weren't, but it is. And then I hope that you have some new ideas and maybe some resources for editing and revising. And even if you didn't get any new ideas, maybe I made you think about an idea that you haven't used in a while. So I'd like to point out some additional resources that are useful. These are 2 series that I've been the lead author on. And the first one, Grammar and Beyond, that link that's on the screen takes you to a site that tells you a bit about that series, but it also has a link to a grammar newsletter that's published monthly. And it has great teaching ideas, not only that can be used for editing and revising, but also for encouraging spoken and more communicative tasks. So these sites are useful, and I think that the books are nice too. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the time that we have.
All right, thank you so much, Randy. That was great. Before we hand it over to my colleague Kyoko, because she's going to field the questions that you've been asking during the webinar, I just wanted to remind everybody that this webinar was recorded, and you will get a link to the recording in your email in 1 to 2 weeks, along with a certificate of attendance. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Kyoko to field some of your questions.
All right, thank you, Randy, for that insightful session. We've been getting great comments about how useful it was, and it was, some people are saying the topic is on point. So we have a question here. It says, what corpora do you recommend for learning about avoiding common mistakes for students in academic writing and grammar?
Well, that's actually a tough question because there really aren't many corpora that are publicly available for avoiding common mistakes. In Grammar and Beyond, we were fortunate enough to have access to a learner corpus that had been coded and also identified for different levels and language types. So I'm going to flip back one slide. In Grammar and Beyond and Grammar and Beyond Essentials, there's a section on common mistakes that's been researched for you. One of the things that I like to do when I'm teaching a writing class is I collect my students' papers digitally, and then I look through them for patterns of errors. And so I would say the best corpus to use for identifying errors is probably past compositions from your students. And then also, you could use a free tool like Lawrence Anthony's AntConc that would help you identify some of those errors, but it's a big task.
All right, thank you. I have another question from a teacher in Indonesia. This writing task is one of the crucial issues in my classroom. I'm eager to know how long does the ideal brainstorm session should last before starting to write?
Well, I think depending on the task, if the task is a fairly easy task, like maybe it's let me turn off this note. If it's a fairly easy task that your students are familiar with or that they have ready access to, I think the brainstorming can be a task that can be relatively short, maybe jotting down ideas or even doing it orally, recording ideas, and then maybe talking to a partner. But if it's something like you're asking your students to do a compare and contrast essay or an argumentative essay, that I would say half an hour wouldn't be too long for brainstorming at an intermediate level. And I think as a teacher, we kind of, I like to ask my students, you guys doing okay? You need more time? And I can look around and check on how I think they're doing. And so that's kind of a non-answer, but also I hope it helps a little bit.
Great tips. Thank you. Here's another question. At what point in the writing process would you suggest having students engage in the editing task? After the peer editing task, but with the first draft, or after a subsequent draft?
I would say I would wait till at least a second draft before having peer editing involved, because that first draft, I think it's a good idea to give feedback. I mean, it can be, as I said, each draft is going to have a different focus. So maybe that first one, you get editing in the sense of, yes, I understood your main idea and it was clear, or no, I need more details. But then that actual editing, I would say, would happen at least, where we look more for grammar and we look for sort of internal organization across paragraphs and supporting details. I would say probably the second, or if you're doing a third draft before the final draft, those would be good places.
Great, thank you. And I've been getting questions about the certificate. I just wanted to remind everyone that you will be receiving a certificate in about 1 to 2 weeks, along with a link to the recording of this webinar. Great, Randy, here's another question.
Whoops, you went away.
Oh, sorry. Here's another question. My students tend to be skeptical of peer editing exercises because they do not trust that their peers can give them valuable feedback. They may feel they know more than their peer. Have you run across this issue, and how do you handle it with your students?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, as I mentioned in the presentation, the students will say, no, I want your feedback, teacher. I don't want I don't want him reading my paper. He doesn't know any more than I do. So that's why I think the checklists are really useful, because I think it builds credibility that if you're in that class, you're at the level where you can read and answer questions. And I think also the idea of not just going straight into peer editing as peer editors, but maybe doing some activities as a class where we are editing other papers, looking at papers to give feedback on, and we all get practice giving feedback on the same paper. Excuse me, that is not a paper of a student in that class, and it's been anonymized. And so we've all gone through training, and then since we're trained, we can trust each other with these specific checklists. I found that to be very successful. But yes, in the end, the teacher's going to read, and and just assure them, yes, but I want to be reading the best possible version, and your peers can help you. I hope that.
Great, thank you. Great. How would we as teachers promote?
Whoops, you went away again.
I'm sorry. I have a very sticky mouse. How would we as teachers promote and engage students so they enjoy doing their own assessment of writing?
Boy, that's a tough one, because sometimes I have to ask myself how much I enjoy my own assessment of my writing. I think it just comes with practice and doing it and making the task something that we see as constructive. And as I mentioned in the presentation, having a specific focus for each draft as we're evaluating that draft, knowing what we're looking for, so then the writer can focus on those aspects of the draft. But I think, to have an appreciation, it goes back to training, practice, and hopefully, if you're in a program where there's a sequence of courses, all the teachers are on board and promoting the same type of editing feedback, and students become familiar with it, and it becomes something that's valued and appreciated.
Great, thank you. And I apologize for asking difficult questions, but you're answering them really greatly, so I appreciate that. All right, here is another question. What are some examples of positive comments you can give about writing when you do peer editing?
Oh, I think one can be, your topic sentence is very clear, maybe even underlining some sentences that you think are really well written and very easy to understand. Putting that, I use online editing a lot, so I do a lot with comments in Word. And I think adding things like, I really like the amount of detail you gave here. If it's an argumentative essay, saying something like this, this support of your argument is really useful, and I appreciate the time it took for you to read about these other outside sources and bring that in. So I think that type of feedback that really shows that as a reader, you're reading, but also that you're appreciating the work that the writer put in. And I think it's also really important to comment on what's well written, because many times we focus on what needs to be changed, but in that, sometimes in another draft, I've seen this happen where students have given, or where I've given, not as positive, positive, yes, but you should change this. And then sometimes students overthink that and go through and change things that were well done. So I think it's nice to say, wow, your introduction was really clear. I know where you're going with this paper. And just highlighting things that you think are really right and spot on. I think that's really a good task, and something to remember, not only as a teacher, but also to train our peer editors to do too. I like the detail you gave. It painted a picture in my head, or I could see why you take this position against this certain, if it's an argumentative task. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. How do you help students to use correct preposition in their writing?
Well, prepositions are a mess. And so what I try to do, prepositions are a mess in English, and many languages don't have them. But what I try to do is teach chunks of language. So many times prepositions, when possible, I try to teach patterns where prepositions are fixed. So when you have the expression in the case of, in and of are going to be there. Those are the only prepositions you want to use. So I try to teach prepositions in context, if you will, as chunks of language. And also we know from research there's certain really frequent adjectives that prepositions go with. So things like I'm afraid of, or I'm surprised by. Those are I teach those as fixed expressions almost. So units. And so I think in that case, we can work on prepositions. We can teach prepositions in a way that helps our students have some anchors. And so, a lot of this comes from corpus research. And again, these series that are on your screen right now, they incorporate that, and we have that information in there. Other series, I don't know if they do. I can't think of many that do. Any that do, actually.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in, but I think we only have time for one more. How do you feel about peer editing in a group for beginning level students to get them used to the process?
I think it can be very useful. I think the task of peer editing needs to be taught to the class, again, using some paper, the same paper, and everybody looking at it that way so you can see the type of feedback that you're going to give. And I also think it's essential to have a checklist. And it could be something as simple as, does every sentence begin with a capital letter? And is there final punctuation at the end of each sentence? Because that trains students to be able to read and look at writing in a certain way in order to be able to give that feedback. Even something like, do the subject and verb, does the verb agree with the subject? Something as simple as that. Having those two tasks to make sure that, structurally and grammatically, the subject and verb agree, but then also form-wise, does each sentence begin with a capital and end with the final punctuation period or whatever? That would be a good task, and I think it's great to start at an early, maybe a level where students are writing even just a few sentences and practicing peer editing. Good idea. And I think some of the questions that we aren't able to answer in this session, those might be questions that in the newsletter that we have that we would address some of those questions. So stay tuned.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Randi, for the wonderful webinar. And thank you everyone for joining us. I know we have people from all around the world, and I know it's late for some of you, so we really appreciate you joining us. So have a great day and evening, and thank you again. Bye.
Thank you very much.